It started, as I understand, in Thomas Jefferson's administration. Would love for you to walk us through the history.
They resisted some of what the Gingrich Congress wanted to do, but ultimately there were serious, very hard negotiations, and they reached an agreement. President Clinton signed legislation that substantially reduced federal spending.
And in many cases, that registry doesn't have access to all the databases that it's supposed to. So it's a huge problem, and you really should be fixing it.
And I recall in our first hearing, we talked about the amount of payments going out the door that are still done by hand, not by computer or electronically. Is that something you all have uncovered in your work?
There's a wealth of information, including information about Donald Trump's falling poll numbers, so you should take a look. Thanks.
I yield back.
Rep. Jeff engages with experts on two critical issues: the history of presidential impoundment of funds and the modern crisis of improper government payments. Mr. Burton explains how presidents from Jefferson to Nixon withheld spending, leading to the 1974 Impoundment Control Act. Mr. Dickerson highlights the staggering $1.1 trillion in Medicaid improper payments, calling for better tech and identity verification. The session draws a contrast between today's limited reforms and the broader bipartisan efforts of the 1990s. A light moment over a miscalculated poll graphic adds a political twist.
Jeff, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And first, I'd like to acknowledge our colleague, Mr. Lynch, for his hard-fought campaign. And I'd like to, at the same time, spend a little bit of my time today working with Mr. Dickerson and Mr. Burton. First, Mr. Dickerson, I want to congratulate you and EPIC for all that you've accomplished. I worked with both Paul and Zoe at the White House in the President's first term, and commend you all for your work. Mr. Burton, if you could, I was reading through your testimony, would love for you just to walk this committee through the history of impoundment and rescissions, I should say. It started, as I understand, in Thomas Jefferson's administration. Would love for you to walk us through the history.
The earliest impoundment that I know of was by Thomas Jefferson. The Congress appropriated money to build some gunboats. Peace broke out, and he chose not to build the gunboats. So he, in effect, impounded the money and sent it back to Congress. That's been going on for a very long time. In older appropriations bills, particularly in the 19th century, generally read not to exceed X dollars. So presidents often didn't, because they didn't think you needed to spend that much money. And President Roosevelt impounded money, and so did President Nixon. And at that point, there was serious objection by the Congress, and the Impoundment Control Act was enacted, which establishes an expedited procedure for rescissions, but it has very broad prohibitions on impoundment. There are certain reprogramming permitted and things of that sort. Obviously, if as with improper payments, if you can't spend the money, that's fine. The president should do that. So the rescissions process, however, is somewhat cumbersome, as you probably just discovered. It could be streamlined and made better, but nonetheless, that's the general requirement today.
And you know, one thing that stood out to me in your opening testimony and your testimony throughout this hearing is you mentioned the work that Speaker Gingrich and President Clinton undertook.
Yes.
So in your estimation, is our committee's work an extension of what was successfully done in the 90s to rein in spending?
Yes and no. I mean, the effort in the 90s was very broad. The Clinton administration was serious about improving government administration. They resisted some of what the Gingrich Congress wanted to do, but ultimately there were serious, very hard negotiations, and they reached an agreement. President Clinton signed legislation that substantially reduced federal spending. And there was a tremendous amount of legislating going on throughout the Congress, not just in one committee, but committee by committee by committee by committee. There was a lot of legislating done, a lot of markups, a lot of investigations, a lot of hearings. It wasn't just one hearing like here. There was systematic throughout the Congress and in government, in the executive branch.
Thank you. Mr. Dickerson, if we could spend a little bit of time in the remaining time we have left talking about improper payments. The first hearing our chairwoman convened was on the troublesome improper payments we discovered over the last 4 years of the Biden administration. Would love for you to touch on some of the challenges we face with respect to verifying identity, with respect to payments that are going out the door. Would love for you to comment on that.
Absolutely. Improper payments is a huge issue. In one program alone, Medicaid, for example, spent $1.1 trillion over the last decade on improper payments. And that is incredibly harmful because it's a waste of taxpayer money, but it's also funds that aren't going to people who are truly vulnerable and truly needy. And so this waste, fraud, and abuse is rampant throughout the federal government. And so one of the major sources of that is the lack of ability to identify the people who are claiming money and checks are going out the door to who are actually eligible. For example, the Do Not Pay registry is supposed to be a database of accounts that the federal government's not supposed to write checks to. But in many cases, those checks go out the door and then they ping the registry. And in many cases, that registry doesn't have access to all the databases that it's supposed to. So it's a huge problem and you really should be fixing it.
And I recall in our first hearing, we talked about the amount of payments going out the door that are still done by hand, not by computer or electronically. Is that something you all have uncovered in your work?
Yeah, I think it's something that we should be using new technology, using AI to actually look at what we have across the government to ensure that only people who are actually eligible for benefits are receiving it, nobody else.
Thank you. Madam Chair, in my closing, just a point of clarification. The poll behind you, behind our ranking member, it adds up to 110%. Just wanted to clarify, is it meant to add up to 110% or is that an error?
Do you yield?
Yeah, I do.
This is from a Quinnipiac poll that was held 2 weeks ago, and this is the data that was provided. There's a wealth of information, including information about Donald Trump's falling poll numbers, so you should take a look. Thanks.
I yield back.
The gentleman yields, and it still adds up to 110%. That's a fake poll right there. I now recognize